and welcome to Climate Check, compliments of the season. My name is Mwiikisa and I'm here to give you information about your world, about your country, and of course, use this production towards climate action. This is Climate Check and it's brought to you courtesy of HIVOS Southern Africa with its alliance partners on the VCA project. Today we are discussing disaster management in the times of climate change. We know as a country we have just suffered a drought and it affected millions of people in this country in various sectors. How do we manage such disasters? It could be a flood, it could be various other types of disasters. And of course, this is why today we're focusing on how we can prevent, manage, or reduce the impact of the climate-induced disasters. This is Climate Check. This is Climate Check, and of course, I will be talking to Dr. Kawe Mubanga, who is a senior lecturer, and this is from Geography and Environment Studies Department at the University of Zambia. And of course, he was part of the developers of the National Adaptation Plan, and so he's better suited to help us understand how best we can manage disasters. This is Climate Check. Join me on the other side as I talk to him. Doc, thank you so much for making time. It's always a pleasure to host you on Climate Check.
Thank you so much, Madam Mary, and thank you so much, dear viewers.
All right. Let's first understand, we're focusing on disaster management in the times of climate change. What qualifies to be a disaster?
Okay. Technically, by definition, a disaster is something that will harm a community or a society, but to such an extent that the lifestyle, the livelihoods of people get disturbed. Mm-hmm. If you have a drought, the livelihoods of people get disturbed. Mm-hmm. If you have a flood, the livelihoods of people get disturbed. So those can qualify to be disasters. Of course, there's a wide range of disasters. Sometimes we have economic disasters, climatic disasters, agricultural disasters, even technological disasters. Mm-hmm. But in the focus of climate change, mostly particularly for Zambia, the major disasters and hazards that we experience relate to droughts, to floods, to high temperatures, to heat stress and heat strokes, and stormy winds.
Okay. Now, as a country, we have experienced a drought, which we're still recovering from, and it has affected almost all the sectors of our economy. How is it possible, or how best can a country like ours respond to a disaster of such a magnitude? Because we know that it was worsened by climate change.
Yes. Ideally, other than the case of disaster reduction and mitigation, we need to generally think about how we can mitigate the effects of climate change. Mm-hmm. We've always said this, and there's usually no two ways about it. When it comes to managing climate change and its disasters, lifestyles have to change. The way we look at systems has to change. For instance, our agricultural patterns have to change. Mostly our agriculture is maize-centric. Maize in itself is not climate smart. I'm sure you understand that. Mm-hmm. Before 1964, before we got independence, in fact, all the way before up to 1973, we never even used to produce maize because our ecosystems is not meant to support production of maize because maize is a heavy feeder in the soil. So every time we produce it, it gets a lot of fertility in the soil. But at the same time, because of the nature of the distribution of our rainfall, whenever you have a dry spell of at least 10 days or more, maize will usually be affected. You need to replant. Okay. If that dry spell happens during the tasseling period, you practically lose most
everything.
Of your... Yes. So we need to change to crops that actually respond to our climatic pattern. Sorghum, millet, cassava. These were actually crops that even our parents were feeding on before maize was introduced in about 1973. Mm-hmm. If you ask our parents who were there in 1964, they didn't even know maize. Now, crops like sorghum, are more of climate smart. Crops like millet are climate smart because even if you have a dry spell, you still be able to harvest because they can survive for a longer period. Other than that, the tubers we were using like cassava, those can also survive for a long time without drought. Without a lot of water. And our issue in Zambia currently might not be the total amount of rainfall we receive, but the distribution.
Okay.
Even as we are facing a dry spell right now, it's very possible that we can receive almost the amount of rains we receive in a season in January and February. But at that time, the pattern of production would have been affected, and we still won't be able to harvest as much as we should. So we need to change our agriculture system if we are to combat particularly the agricultural hazards that we are facing. But when it comes to the flooding hazards, which sometimes becomes an issue, especially if we receive a lot of rainfall, these are hazards that can be combated, firstly, by strengthening our own early warning systems. If ZMD is strengthened and they are able to tell us that during this period to this period we are going to have a flood accurately, then we would need to see how our infrastructure and our systems should respond to that. The starting point is for us to be able to tell in advance that at this period we'll have a flood or we'll have a drought. Then we can be able to look at how our infrastructure can be strengthened to withstand such kind of flooding. But let me give a bit of a specific example of how some of these hazards affect us. Almost every year, particularly in Lusaka, Kanyama gets to be among the first to be affected by cholera.
Yes.
The cholera we experience usually is highly climate related.
Okay.
Because mostly when floods come, the areas around Kanyama, Chawama, they lie on a geology we call the Karoo rock. That's calcium carbonate.
Okay.
Calcium carbonate mostly allows a lot of water to pass through. So if there's a flood, whatever dirt is on top is allowed to sink into the ground. And because this is a calcium carbonate infested area, much of that water will move longer distances in the soil. Now, most of those communities have shallow wells.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes they also use pit latrines. So what happens is if a flood comes, gets things from a pit latrine and ends up driving them into the shallow wells which people are drinking. It contaminates the water. It's a similar thing we experienced at the VCA in Kamwala South. When we had a lot of flooding, a lot of the dirt on top ended up into people's boreholes. So because of that kind of flooding, the water down gets contaminated. In essence, the climatic hazards turned into a health hazard where we had a lot of cholera cases recorded.
How can we strengthen our mechanisms or approaches towards reducing the impact of disasters? What else can we do as a developing country to ensure that even though we may not prevent some of these disasters because they're climatic induced, but then the impacts can be minimized or reduced? Is it possible?
Yes. So currently, I think even at a global level, the major focus now is on risk reduction, disaster risk reduction. We see a disaster ahead and try to prevent its effect before it even occurs. And that's where the early warning system comes in. If we are able to see a disaster ahead, we can put mechanisms in place to prevent that. DMMU usually is there sometimes to even manage disasters that have already occurred. Now, if there's a flood in Imbabala, they will be on the ground to try and see how they can assist people with basic needs there. But that's when a disaster has occurred. Our main concentration should be to see that a disaster will occur and prevent it from occurring. And that's strengthening our early warning systems. But the challenge sometimes is, by nature, you can't always budget for a disaster because even our budgets do not always include aspects of disasters. So this is why at international level, there are conversations on loss and damage.
Yes.
Loss and damage fund, which has been established, which by the way Zambia can benefit from, is meant to handle those disasters that our national budgets are not able to handle. And of course, there are mechanisms that are being set in place to ensure that countries can access this, but even in a more quicker way. Because if you have a disaster and you need funding, it shouldn't take as long as it takes us to get the money from GCF and everywhere. So the Loss and Damage Fund will hopefully be one of those funds that will help us to be managing disasters in case we have them. But at a local level, what we need to do first is to identify the actual disasters that impact us more. The National Adaptation Plan that was done highlights some of the common disasters we have: the floods, the droughts, the heat stress, the stormy wind. So we can plan for this because we know the hotspots. We know that always Kanyama with its calcium carbonate area will always be a flood zone. So can we have our infrastructure be able to manage the drainages so that the flooding does not get into the soil or into the groundwater? That is something we can do because we know that is a hotspot.
Okay.
We know certain areas that are low-lying, we always have flood issues. So we can always do something about that in advance. Areas like Southern Province, which tends to be affected mostly by droughts, also gets affected by flash floods. So we can zone these hot spots and then be able to manage the disasters that occur in these because we know them.
How much community engagement is being done out there by the government, civil society organizations, and all the stakeholders in response to climate-induced disasters? You speak about the National Adaptation Plan, which is a document that actually speaks to how we should respond to disasters, how we should adapt to the times that we live in now. But apart from having this information in this document and maybe mainstreamed in other ministries as they respond, how engaged are the people on the ground to know that as I'm building this house, this is what I should look out for, this is what I should do? It's one thing to have the document, it's another to have it being implemented by the actual people because they may not have the information.
You're very right, actually. And sadly, Madam Mary, I don't think we are doing enough of the community engagement. And you might actually be talking about the community engagement, but I think we need to start a lot higher, even with our members of parliament. You might think this information is in the public domain, but I think the training even needs to start with our own members of parliament, who are actually the ones who are in direct contact with the communities. If the members of parliament understand that in your constituents, these are the disasters, these are the issues that are expected, it's easier for them to actually be able to transmit much of that information to the rural communities. We understand that certain government ministries are actually charged with the responsibility of being able to communicate to the locals. But I don't think much of that is happening. Of course, it could be a case of funding. It could also be a case of the actual government department being trained to understand these issues and be able to do community awareness. So I am very well aware that not much of community engagement is actually getting done, and we need to do more on this.
Doc, you spoke about the Loss and Damage Fund, and during COP29, we actually heard news that the first board meeting for the Loss and Damage Fund for Africa will be held in Zambia next year. Does that put us in a better position to be able to apply for this fund? And are we at the point where we are closer to this fund being implemented? What is going on? Because there seems to be so much work to be done before we can see the benefit of this establishment.
Yes, usually there always is a lot of work to be done when a pronouncement is made, because after the fund was agreed on, there had to be a lot of technical work. You need to understand where should this fund be sitting, which institution should be able to manage this fund. But even at that level, it's just a starting point. Even us as a country, we need to be prepared to apply for such funding. For instance, which institutions in our own country should be responsible for applying for this funding. I understand it could be ZMD because they are closer to dealing with disasters. But is ZMD itself prepared enough? Do we have enough capacity that will allow us to get much of this funding? This is not funding that is just going to come and you are given like that. It needs to come with possibly proposal development. So you need expertise that are going to be able to write bankable projects that should be able to attract us this funding. I do not exactly know the exact modalities that are in place now because this funding is not yet open to everyone. But as a country, this is the time we need to prepare and station ourselves to be able to access this funding. If we have agreed or we agree that this particular institution is the one that will be in the forefront of getting this funding for us, then let's strengthen the capacity there. If DMMU will be responsible, let's train the people around DMMU who are going to help us with developing bankable projects. Let's actually identify hotspots that we can target, that we know that these are areas where a lot of the flooding or the droughts or the disasters we want to manage are. And right at this point, start making sure that we have ideas that we are going to sell to be able to access this funding. So there's still a lot of work even at a local level.
Is there any other source of funding that Zambia can leverage on to be able to respond to disasters that come about as a result of climate change, beyond our national budget, whose competing needs may be more?
Yes, we actually have quite a number of sources. Among them is what is called the Global Climate Fund. In fact, the NDA is actually responsible for helping us access as much funding from the GCF. Of course, we have projects under the GEF that are also going on, helping with climate funding. World Bank itself has also been assisting with climate funding. However, what is common in all of this is that we need expertise that is able to develop climate smart projects that can allow us to access funding. Of course, one of the major hindrances is also the access modalities. If it's a GCF funding, you have to do a lot of engagement with them before actually they can be able to give you this funding. So this is not something you are going to do in a hurry, like you have a disaster and you are going to apply to GCF. No. So we need to identify projects in advance. We need to identify what possible disasters, what possible hazards are going to affect us. Maybe in 2030, maybe even going forward, and start preparing ourselves for those to be able to access funds to handle those issues. So we have all these multilateral institutions that offer climate funding, but expertise and bankable projects are necessary for us to access this funding.
Now, one of the sectors that was impacted by the drought that we have been dealing with as a country is the energy sector. And we know the role the energy sector plays to move the wheels of the economy. And it has impacted a lot of SMEs. It has impacted our economy. But the good news is that we're seeing people try to adapt in their own way. You see people using solar and all these things. Now, government recently signed a bilateral agreement with Norway and Sweden at COP29, which for carbon trading and also financing in the renewable energy sector. How can we leverage on such documents, on such agreements to be able to revive our energy sector and maybe move away from depending on hydro energy sustainably?
Yeah, that's very important. And there are a number of ways of doing that. Firstly, we can have what you have indicated where people are practically coping. They get a solar and it helps them to cushion the energy needs that they have. Solar and so many of these renewable energies could be considered transitory mechanisms for energy transition because you might not expect to be completely sustained by such kind of renewable energy technologies. However, this is where now complete adaptation needs to come in, and this might require a lot of resources, which is where heavy funding might need to come in. Take, for instance, the Ministry of Energy has identified over 80 of geothermal hotspots, which are potential sources for energy. For us, actually, to transition from hydro even to geothermal. By the way, much of Kenya is using actually geothermal energy. Of course, I understand that the process can be quite expensive, but explorations can possibly start. It might not be something that can be done in a year or two, but this is an area worth looking into because we've already seen from Kenya that this is an area that actually works. Of course, the modalities might be different a little bit, but it's an area that is worth exploring in. Issues of solar plantations, where now we can be able to leverage on the number of sunlight hours we have in certain places. If you look at Siavonga, it's one of the areas that actually receive longer sunlight in Zambia, and areas in Chama, in Eastern Province. We have longer hours of sunlight. So if we can explore ways of setting up solar plantations in those areas, they can be able to cushion much of the energy that we are in need of. I'm happy that the government has produced what is called the Integrated Resource Plan, of course, with the help of the Climate Compatible Growth Network program. And these plans actually give us ideas of how we can transition from the current hydro that is failing us to different kinds of renewable energy that are more practical in different areas. Sometimes you might find that solar is more practical maybe in an area like Southern Province or in an area like Eastern Province where there's longer sunlight hours. We can be able to leverage on things like that. If geothermal is useful where there's a lot of hot springs, we can also be able to leverage that and integrate the different energy mixes so that at the end of it all, we become a lot more sustainable. We can't completely do away with the hydro because it's also a very important resource because of the many water bodies we have. But if we move towards integrating these different energy mixes, I think we'll be a lot more comfortable than we are.
We had Mr. Nkwado on this show last week where he spoke about how we should pay attention to the weekly and daily weather updates because even he confirmed that the changes are just happening and so we have to pay attention. But even then, is it possible for us to prepare just in case things don't go our way so that we prevent another disaster?
Yes, it is very possible. And our preparation first has to start on the ground. If we can be able to deal with rainwater harvesting so that we can use some of that water for irrigation at a local level, that would be sustainable. But at the same time, in the long run, we actually need to change our agriculture systems. We need to understand that really our rainfall patterns have changed. For most of us who used to receive rainfall in October, November, now the rainfall is coming well late into December. We need to be alive to that fact. But at the same time, also our seed breeding industries need to understand that we can no longer afford those very late maturing varieties in certain areas. So research has to happen in areas where the crop growing season is short. We need now to have research that is giving us varieties that can survive in there. But even more importantly, we need to enhance nature-based solutions so that if an area is dry, let's try and see how we can improve the water table by allowing water to sink and not always creating a lot of concrete on top that is able to drive the water away. So these are some of just the changes that can help us to manage through these natural disasters.
We have come to the end of the program for this week. Join me again next week, same time, same channel. Remember to always do your part to protect and ensure that our environment is safe from climate change. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.